Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. I'm guessing that you figured out by now that this is our special military episode of the podcast. I want to thank each and every one of you that have served or are currently serving in the armed forces to protect our great country. It means a lot to me that you're out there willing to do that. On this episode, we are going to hear all kinds of war stories from you guys. The response was off the charts, and I even had to turn some of them away. Not to worry though, I will use them all in future episodes of the show, and I do mean all. Our stories this time include The Machine Gun Nest, a warm-hearted tale from Ray Payton, and David Larson tells of a neighbor's account at Normandy Beach. We have a haunted guard tower, Recon Hell, and a Korean hillside. We also continue with Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett, read by Mark Nelson. The music that you've been listening to was provided by Ready Music. Royalty-free, high-quality music and sound for free. And now, this 5-minute mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by a college education. While it won't help you with murder, it will lead to bigger and better things. After all, I have a college education and, well, maybe I'm not the best example, but, oh heck, let's just listen to this week's story.
Our story takes place in Green's Gap, a small town in the Southern Cavern District. Green's Gap Hospital, Dr. Melville speaking.
Doctor, there's been an accident out at Echo Cavern.
Accident? What kind of accident?
Two men was exploring, and they got lost last night. One's unconscious. You better come quick before he's dead.
I hope you know how to get out to Echo Cavern, Lem.
Yes, I'll be in town constable and ambulance driver. I reckon I know about all there is to know about this country.
Ever been in the cavern, Lem?
Once, Doc Melville, when I was a boy. Nearly got my heart tanned off of my paw. Echo Cavern's a mighty treacherous place.
You mean it's easy to get lost in?
Yeah, not only that, Doc. It's that cavern gas, carbon something.
Carbon dioxide?
Yes, that's it. All of a sudden you run into some of that stuff, and before you know it, then you're out.
Still, people seem to go exploring there.
More fools they be. I wouldn't go into them caverns. Leastwise, not without a dog.
A dog? What for?
Well, if a dog keels over, then you know the gas is collecting.
I'm afraid, Mr. Gatty, your friend is dead.
Yeah, poor Patsy. It was from the gas, wasn't it, Doc?
That's what it looks like to me.
Why did you go in that cavern anyway?
Well, Patsy asked me to. He never seen a cave before.
How far did you go in?
Well, it didn't seem very far, but all of a sudden we lost our way.
Where was that?
Well, how do I know whereabouts it was if we was lost? We tried to trace our way back, but it wasn't no use. And Patsy started to get scared. It's kind of funny to see a big guy like that get scared.
Yes, he is rather big, isn't he?
Yeah, 6'4". The mob used to call us Mutton Jeff.
And then what happened?
Well, I was a little scared myself. But we stuck together, walking in the dark with only my flash from the car. And all of a sudden, Patsy keeled over.
From the gas?
Yeah, that's what I figured. His head hit on a rock, and I guess that just about finished him off.
Yeah. I suppose you reckon yourself pretty lucky, mister.
Yeah, sure. I figure it was only 'cause I'm 5'3" that I got out of there alive. And the gas must have been just about a foot over my head.
Yeah? And what do you think of that, Doc Melville?
I think you'd better arrest Mr. Gatty for the murder of his friend, Patsy. What was the flaw in Gatty's story? Do you know it? In a moment, we'll hear from Lem and Dr. Melville. But first...
What an awful use of dogs. I have half a mind to contact the SPCA. The problem is, well, this happened over 70 years ago, and from my research, the practice of the use of short dogs to detect gas has been replaced with short robots. And hey, that's okay with me. Get back to our story.
And now, let's see whether you're as observant as Lem and the doctor.
Hey, copper, let me put my hands down. They're tired.
When you're in Green's Gap jail, not before.
I don't get it. It was a good story. I still can't figure how you found out.
Lem tells me they used to take dogs in the cavern because the gas is heavier than air. It collects on the floor. If you really met gas, you would have keeled over first before your pal Patsy.
Well, what do you know? I tell you, nowadays in this murder racket, you need a college education.
Gas is heavier than air? Not always true. Take, for example, helium. It's lighter than air and therefore would affect the tall guy first. Of course, our guy wouldn't pass out and hit his head.
He would just talk funny and over time might act a bit silly.
So, I guess you can say this one's confirmed. With a caveat, of course.
Is that you say?
I have to say this. I have not personally been in the military, but members of my family have served with honor in the Army, Navy, and National Guard. My grandfather served in World War I in the U.S. Navy as a musician and Navy chaplain. He wanted to serve again as chaplain during the Second World War, but he was needed at home to serve as pastor to 5 churches. My uncles George and John were sent to the Pacific during World War II, and my Uncle Marv was in the National Guard at that time. More recently, my nephew Ty served proudly in the Navy and spent time all over the world aboard the aircraft carrier John C. Stennis, CVN 74. I had the chance to serve in the National Guard after high school, but I didn't take that opportunity. I've regretted that at times in my life, but I don't regret how things turned out for me. I do want to say what an honor it was to receive your stories for this podcast, and I thank all of you that contacted me. So, with that said, these are your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story comes from my father, technically stepfather, but I never thought of him that way. He was awarded the Purple Heart, but came away from serving in World War II and Korea, scarred and changed forever. He died at the age of 90 in 2008 and never really spoke about his time served. However, he did tell me one story, and I want to share it with you now. During the early part of World War II, he was in Italy as a member of the 3rd Infantry. He was a platoon leader and was ordered to take a German machine gun nest atop a hill. He and his group stormed up the mound, taking heavy fire. He told me that the only thing that he could think to do was to keep moving forward. Everything else was gone from his mind. He arrived at what amounted to be a small communication shack and found that the main gun had been silenced. He broke through the door, remembered firing his weapon aggressively. When the smoke cleared, he saw before him several badly wounded or dead German officers. He quickly gathered their weapons, including a prized German Luger pistol, and piled them near the door. On the wall, he saw a shot-up German flag. He pulled that down and stuffed it into his field pack. It was then his cognitive thoughts began taking notes. He realized that he was alone. None of the rest of his platoon had made it to the communication shack. He said nothing else about this event except that his CO had taken the Luger and that he used the flag for the rest of the war as a blanket. From what I understood, he slept on top of it. My younger sister still has that flag, along with a Legionnaire's cap and what remains of his many medals. He told bits of other tales, one Christmas in a foxhole eating Spam, another time in Korea as a tank commander, and endless hours marching all the way to Germany and the Battle of the Bulge, which, by the way, he missed by hours because he was shipped home to be with his ailing mother. I wish he had told me more stories, but what he did share was enough for me to know that war is, in fact, hell. Our second story comes from a regular contributor to the show, Mr. Ray Payton from Louisiana. This one is very short, but what an incredible event. Ray has called it, "They'll Send You Home and I Will Bury You." Ray also wrote this, but credits it to his dad, John Payton Sr., who passed away in 2008. Well, Ron, I want to share this story. In 2008, I was home from Iraq on emergency leave. My father had been diagnosed with lung cancer. I had 10 days with him, and on that last day, I was scheduled to depart Lafayette and head back overseas. I didn't want to go. I was not regular Army. I was a contractor and could quit any time. I figured this might be the last time I ever saw my dad alive. So I was at his house, waiting on my ride to the airport, talking to my father, and trying to make up an excuse, any excuse, to stay. He turned to me and said that I had to go. So I asked him, "Well, Dad, what if I'm over there and you die?" He just looked at me and said nothing. So then I asked, "What if I'm over there and I get killed?" Without any hesitation on his part whatsoever, sternly and forcibly, he replied, "Then they'll send you home, and I will bury you." Wow, I thought. Now that's being frank. That is life, and I never forgot it. I got in the car waiting for me outside and left for the airport. Ray Payton, Louisiana. Our next story is not your typical military fare. I don't want to say any more about it as not to spoil the surprise. It comes to us from Anthony Carr from Oklahoma and is titled The Haunted Guard Tower. Hello, Ron. I hope I made it in time with my submission. It took some time deciding which story to share from my time in the military. I never had a good time working the security force for my first deployment, whether I was stuck at the gate or in a tower. However, the story I will tell comes from then. On my first night at our outpost, before I even had a good sense of direction, was a telltale sign that I was in for some trouble. I was posted alone in Tower 2. The towers were numbered 1 through 4. This tower faced a mountain to the north and a Pakistan village to the east. I didn't know about the village yet because they were going through a power outage. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. No sooner than I had put on my night vision, their power was restored. All I know is I saw flickering lights appearing in a sequence and a long line. I pictured your Hollywood scenario, a bunch of guys on horses holding torches ready to raid. I felt pretty stupid when I called this in because HQ didn't need to see anything to know what had me in a panic. This was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. I was finally comfortable as you can get in a war zone when I had to cover the night shift in Tower 3. It was a quiet night and during a local holiday that even the combatants relax for a month-long religious practice. I was bored and admiring the stars when I heard it. Something started rustling right outside the wall and under my tower. I shouted down and readied for who knows what. I felt adrenaline kicking in and my perception of time slowing down. I searched around and even underneath the tower, but there was nothing or no one around. Just as I convinced myself I had been awake too long, and as if, right on cue, I heard a soft meh outside of the wall. At that point, I experienced a strange mix of horror and confusion. What I was hearing was the disembodied voice of a goat. Well, at least I had company. My friends made fun of the disembodied goat experience, but everyone had had their share of unexplained noises while working that haunted guard tower, Tower Number 3. Well, Anthony, I can only imagine how that must have felt. I'm not sure I would have taken it quite as well. I do have to say, and I'm sure the listeners as well, we would love to hear more of those Tower 3 stories. Please feel free to send them in, and thank you for your service, Anthony. Our last story comes from David Larson. David is also a regular contributor to the show and has also been part of the second podcast, The Horror Express. David sent in this story he calls Friendly Fire. David is from Ogden, Utah. Hey Ron, this isn't my story exactly, but is one that I was told as a child. Growing up, I had an elderly neighbor. His name was Mr. Scotty, and for $5, the occasional bit of smoked salmon, and as many stories as we had time to go through, I would mow his lawn for him. Oftentimes, I would mow the lawn after lunch and then enjoy stories until my mom would come calling for me for dinner, which was usually around 6 or 7. This story is from World War II and is about one of his friends, who I simply call Mr. C, and is a story of how his ankle injury had saved his life. It begins on an LCVP, or Landing Craft Vehicle Personal. They were crammed into these boats like sardines. Mr. C and his mates were landing on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, and were some of the first of the few hundred men sent to storm the Nazi pillboxes. They were terrified, but knew that what they did needed to happen and would help topple the Third Reich, if only for a foothold. For Mr. C, he remembered praying that he would come home and that he would get to see his family again. The doors slammed open, and he and his mates had no hesitation. They sprinted towards what looked like certain death. He passed what he called shapes of young men who had already fallen to enemy fire. He sprinted past them, scared but determined to take ground that they needed to take. The crack and rattle of shells and small missiles were whizzing past him, unrelenting all around him. Then more cracks and boons centered in on his position, and then a searing pain shot through his ankle, sending him to the dirt. Mr. C looked up to see his panicked friend firing on a pillbox. He watched in horror as his friend fell to the ground from the gunfire that surely would have been his fate. He was shot by accident as his friend had panicked and shot him through the ankle, saving his life at the price of his own. At this point, Mr. C stopped his story and lifted his pant leg. With a smile, he showed us his fused, unmoving ankle and the remainder of the scars he had earned that day. I hope I did this story justice, and I'm thankful to him for everything he did and for telling me this story. Mr. Scotty is now 94 and still goes fishing on a regular basis. He's always been like a grandfather to me. David Larson, Ogden, Utah. Thank you, David, for that story, and thank you to both Mr. C and Mr. Scotty for their service. And now, this moment in time. The date is August 13th, 1961, and this is A Moment in Time. The Berlin Wall. During the early years of the Cold War, West Berlin was a geographical loophole through which thousands of East Germans fled to the democratic West. In response, the communist East German authorities built a wall that totally encircled West Berlin. It was thrown up overnight on August 13th, 1961. Here is a news report from that day.
This morning, East Berlin presents an eerie picture. Communist troops in force on every street corner. Soldiers of the Communist National Army drawn up along the sector boundary with columns of armored cars, and behind them, by the tens of thousands, the workers' militia in their sloppy brown uniforms and visored caps, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the stormtroopers of Adolf Hitler. Platoons of People's Police in their ink blue uniforms in every subway and train station, barring the way to the platforms of trains that used to run to West Berlin. Groups of young men and women arguing with militiamen over their rights to pass down certain streets that have been sealed off. East Berlin is an armed camp. It is also a witch's cauldron gradually coming to a boil.
What of the people that lived on that historic day? Our own Tom Williams was there, and he had this to say about it.
Late in the summer of 1961, I was stationed at Camp Drum, New York. We received orders that we were to ship out to Berlin, Germany, to support the Berlin Brigade due to a wall being constructed. After closing Camp Drum for the summer, we shipped out of New York Harbor on the USNS Rose with full equipment and vehicles. After several days of rough seas, we arrived in Bremerhaven, Germany, and by way of the Autobahn, we proceeded to Berlin, which was 100 miles into East German territory. Now, the situation was very dicey, and tensions were running high with the Russians, so we received orders not to let the Russians or East Germans know how many troops we were bringing into Berlin. So we placed only 4 soldiers at the tailgates of our 2.5-ton trucks, that is, 2 facing each other. We were given orders not to let the East soldiers look into our vehicles at any cost. At one control point, a gray-haired Russian officer tried to climb up on the trailer hitch to look into the back of our vehicle. My sergeant, he shook his head at the man and even tried to wave him off, but the officer was determined to climb up anyways. When he got his left hand on the tailgate and 1 foot on the trailer hitch, my sergeant hit the knuckles of the officer with the butt of his rifle. The officer dropped back down to the ground, holding his fingers and looking sheepishly at his assistant to say, "You didn't see that, did you?" Giving us a scowling look, we were sure that we would have trouble now, but to our surprise, he gave a signal for our convoy to proceed. You can imagine how we felt as we arrived with no further incidents. To top it all off, there were West Berliners lining the streets to wave us in. What a welcoming sight it was. Tom from Berlin.
That was not Tom's only account of the events of that day in Germany. This second account came a few weeks later in October of 1961.
Now for me, the day the earth stood still, well, it happened as I sat atop a personnel carrier facing off the East German tanks in October of 1961 here in Berlin. As a combat engineer in 1961, and at the height of the Cold War, my company was assigned to the Berlin Brigade because the wall was being built. West Berlin was 100 miles into the communist East German territory. As a matter of fact, we were the only troops who were ever surrounded in communist territory. Shortly after arriving in October, the day the earth stood still for me, we were issued weapons and were sent to Checkpoint Charlie and was positioned on top of a personnel carrier. We knew that at any moment, if there was a wrong move on either side, World War III would certainly begin. As I was facing the east, I knew that those other soldiers didn't want to be there either, but here we were, waiting and praying. But suddenly I heard a bang and instantly looked up to see where the sound came from, with, of course, my heart in my throat. But my buddy on the left tapped me on the arm and pointed down to the street, and there stood a frail senior citizen holding up 3 bananas for me, and my buddy saying, "Thank you." She and the other West Berliners never knew until years later how close we all came to the end that day, not even the street sweeper who was cleaning in front of our armored carrier. A heartening incident occurred about a month later. We had the right to pass into the East Sector at any time without hindrance. And one day, to prove to the East that we would exercise this right, we were placed on military buses and we passed through Checkpoint Charlie. There was no trouble other than an East German walking through the bus to show his authority. And at one point we stopped at a traffic light, and as I looked out the window, I saw another elderly lady observing us. Now she looked left, and then sheepishly she looked right and slowly backed up between 2 buildings. She gave me a wave and a smile, and I knew that this whole thing was political and that there were people on the other side who like us. It was a very touching moment. My point to this is we're all human beings, and I wish we could act as such. All the best, Tom.
Thank you again, Tom. You are an amazing fellow, and I can't thank you enough for everything you do for the podcast. As I talk to people about the show, I hear over and over just how much they love your segments. Please keep them rolling in because we want to hear from you. And Tom, thank you for your service.
Okay, it's time for another installment of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. The Nipe's lair is under the island of Manhattan, which is now a game preserve. He's under surveillance of some 700 robot rats. And Bart Stanton is the twin brother of Mart Stanton, who was injured in a radiation accident at the age of 2 and is severely disabled. And now it's time for Chapter 11 of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett.
2 massive objects floating in space looked very much like deeply pitted pieces of rock. The larger one, roughly pear-shaped and about 1/4 of a mile in its greatest dimension, was actually that, a huge hunk of rock. The smaller, much smaller, of the 2 was not what it appeared to be. It was a phony. Anyone who had been able to conduct a very close personal inspection of it would have recognized it for what it was, a camouflaged spaceboat. The camouflaged spaceboat was on a near-collision course with reference to the larger mass, although their relative velocities were not great. At precisely the right time, the smaller drifted by the larger, only a few hundred yards away. The weakness of the gravitational fields generated between the 2 caused only a slight change of orbit on the part of both bodies. Then they began to separate. But during the few seconds of their closest approach, a third body detached itself from the camouflaged spaceboat and shot rapidly across the intervening distance to land on the surface of the floating mountain. The third body was a man in a spacesuit. As soon as he landed, he sat down, stock still, and checked the instrument case he held in his hands. No response. Thus far, then, he had succeeded. He had had to pick his time precisely. The people who were already on this small planetoid could not use their detection equipment while the planetoid itself was within detection range of Beacon 971, only 280 miles away. Not if they wanted to keep from being found. Radar pulses emanating from a presumably lifeless planetoid would be a dead giveaway. Other than that, they were mathematically safe. Mathematically safe they would be if and only if they depended upon the laws of chance. No ship moving through the asteroid belt would dare to move at any decent velocity without using radar, So the people on this particular lump of planetary flotsam would be able to spot a ship's approach easily, long before their own weak detection system would register on the pickups of an approaching ship. The power and range needed by a given detector depends on the relative velocity. The greater that velocity becomes, the more power, the greater range needed. At 1 mile per second, a ship needs a range of only 30 miles to spot an obstacle 30 seconds away. At 10 miles per second, it needs a range of 300 miles. The man who called himself Stanley Martin had carefully plotted the orbit of this particular planetoid, and had let his spaceboat coast in without using any detection equipment except the visual. It had been necessary, but very risky. The asteroid belt, that magnificently useful collection of stone and metal lumps revolving about the sun between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, is somewhat like the old-fashioned merry-go-round. If every orbit in the belt were perfectly circular, the analogy would be more exact. If they were, then every rock in the belt would follow every other in almost exactly the way every merry-go-round horse follows every other. The gravitational attraction between the various bodies in the belt can be neglected. It is much less, on the average, than the gravitational pull between any two horses on a carousel. If every orbit of those millions upon millions of pieces of rock and metal were precisely circular, then they would constitute the grandest, biggest merry-go-round in the universe. But those orbits are not circular, and even if they were, they would not remain so long. The great mass of Jupiter would soon pull them out of such perfect orbits and force them to travel about the sun in elliptical paths, and therein lies the trouble. If their paths were exactly circular, then no two of that vast number of planetoids would ever collide. They would march about the sun in precise order, like the soldiers in a military parade, except that they would retain their spacing much longer than any group of soldiers could possibly manage to do. But the orbits are elliptical. There is a chance that any two given bodies might collide, although the chance is small. The one compensation is that if they do collide, they won't strike each other very hard. The detective was not worried about collision. He was worried about observation. Had the people here seen his boat? If so, had they recognized it in spite of the heavy camouflage? And even if they only suspected, what would be their reaction? He waited. It takes nerve and patience to wait for 13 solid hours without making any motion other than an occasional flexing of muscles. But he managed that long before the instrument case that he held waggled a meter needle at him. The one tension-relieving factor was the low gravity. The problem of sleeping on a bed of nails is caused by the likelihood of the sleeper accidentally throwing himself off the bed. The probability of puncture or discomfort from the points is almost negligible. When the needle on the instrument panel flickered, he got to his feet and began moving. He was almost certain that he had not been detected. Walking was out of the question. This was a silicate alumina rock, not a nickel-iron one. The group of people that occupied it had deliberately chosen it that way, so that there would be no chance of its being picked out for slicing by one of the mining teams in the asteroid belt. Granted, the chance of any given metallic planetoids being selected was very small, but they had not wanted to take even that chance. Therefore, without any magnetic field to hold him down, and with only a very tiny gravitic field, the detective had to use different tactics. It was more like mountain climbing than anything else, except that there was no danger of falling. He crawled over the surface in the same way that an alpine climber might crawl up the side of a steep slope, seeking handholds and toeholds and using them to propel himself onward. The only difference was that he covered distance a great deal more rapidly than a mountain climber could. When he reached the spot he wanted, he carefully concealed himself beneath a craggy overhang. It took a little searching to find exactly the right spot, but when he did, he settled himself into a place in a small pit and began more elaborate preparations. Self-hypnosis required nearly 10 minutes. The first 5 or 6 minutes were taken up in relaxing from his exertions. Gravity notwithstanding, he had to push his 180 pounds over a considerable distance. When he was completely relaxed and completely hypnotized, he reached up and cut down the valve that fed oxygen into his suit. Then, of his own will, he went cataleptic. A single note, sounded by the instruments in the case at his side, woke him instantly. He came fully awake, as he had commanded himself to do. Immediately, he turned up his oxygen intake, at the same time glancing at the clock dial in his helmet. He smiled. 19 days and 7 hours. He had calculated it almost precisely. He wasn't more than an hour off, which was really pretty good, all things considered. He consulted his instruments again. The supply ship was 10 minutes away. The smile stayed on his face as he prepared for further action. The first 2 minutes were conscientiously spent in inhaling oxygen. Even under the best cataleptic conditions, the human body tended to slow down too much. He had to get himself prepared for violent movement. 8 minutes left. He climbed out of the little grotto where he had concealed himself and moved toward the spot where he knew the airlock to the caverns underneath the planetoid's surface was hidden. Then again he concealed himself and waited, while he continued to breathe deeply of the highly oxygenated air in his suit. 5 minutes before the ship landed, he swallowed 8 ounces of the nutrient solution from the tank in the back of his helmet. The solution of amino acids, vitamins, and honey sugar also contained a small amount of stimulant of the dexedrine type and 1% ethanol. He waited for another minute for the solution to take effect. Then he unholstered his gun. The supply ship wasn't a big one. He had known it wouldn't be. It was only a little larger than the one he had used to come out here. It dropped down to the surface of the small planetoid only 10 meters from the hidden trapdoor that led to the airlock beneath the surface. Suddenly, he could hear voices in the earphones of his helmet. "Lasser?" "Yeah, it's me, Fritz. I got all the supplies and a nice package of good news." The airlock trapdoor opened and a space-suited figure came out. "How about the deal?" "That's the good news," said the second suited figure as it came from the airlock of the grounded spaceboat. "Another 5 million." The detective, hidden behind the nearby crag of rock, listened and watched for a minute or so while the 2 men began unloading cases of foodstuffs from the spaceboat. Then, satisfied that it was perfectly safe, he aimed his gun and shot twice in rapid succession. The range was almost point-blank, and there was, of course, no need to take either gravity or air resistance into account. The pellets of the shotgun-like charge that blasted out from the gun were small, needle-shaped, and massive. They were oriented point-forward by the magnetic field along the barrel of the weapon. Of the hundreds of charges fired, only a few penetrated the spacesuits of the targets, but those few were enough. The powerful drug in the needle-pointed head of each tiny crystal went directly into the bloodstream of each target. Each man felt an itching sensation. He had less than 2 seconds to think about it before unconsciousness overtook him and he slumped nervelessly. Gun in hand, the detective ran across the intervening space quickly, his body only a few degrees from the horizontal, and his toes paddling rapidly to propel him over the rough rock. He braked himself to a halt and slapped air patches over the areas where his charges had struck the men's suits, sealing the tiny air leaks, and, at the same time, driving more of the tiny needles into their skins. They would be out for a long time. Neither of them had yet fallen to the ground. That would take several minutes under this low gravity. He left them to drop and headed toward the open airlock. This was what he had been waiting for all these 19 days in cataleptic hypnosis. He couldn't have cut his way into the hideout from the outside. He had had to wait until it was opened, and that time had come only with the supply ship. Once in the airlock, he touched the control stud that would close the outer door, pump air into the waiting room, and open the inner door. Here was his greatest point of danger, greater even than the danger of coming to the planetoid itself, or the danger of waiting 19 days in a cataleptic trance for the coming of the supply ship. If the ones who remained within suspected anything at all, then his chances of coming out of this alive were practically nil. But there was no reason why they should suspect. They should think that the man coming in was one of their own. The radio contact between the men outside had been limited to a few micromilliwatts of power, necessarily, since radio waves of very small wattage can be decoded at tremendous distances in open space. The men inside the planetoid certainly should not have been able to pick up any more than the beginning of the early conversation, before it had been cut completely off by the intervening layers of solid rock. The chamber he entered was a high-speed airlock. Unlike the soundless discharge of his special gun in the outer airlessness, the blast of air that came into the waiting chamber was like a hurricane in noise and force. The room filled with air in a very few seconds. The detective held on to the handholds tightly, while the brief but violent winds buffeted him. He turned as the inner door opened. His eyes took in the picture in a fraction of a second. In an even smaller fraction, his mind assimilated the picture. The woman was dark-haired, dark-eyed, and muscular. Her mouth was wide and thick-lipped beneath a large nose. The man was leaner and lighter, bony-faced and beady-eyed. The woman said, "Fritz? What?" And then he shot them both with gun number 2. No needle charges this time. Such shots would have blown them both in two, unprotected as they were by spacesuits. The small handgun merely jangled their nerves with a high-powered blast of accurately beamed supersonics. While they were still twitching, he went over and jabbed them with a drug needle. Then he went on into the hideout. He had to knock out one more man, whom he found asleep in a small room off the short corridor. It took a gas bomb to get the 2 women who were guarding the kid. He made sure that the Benheim boy was all right. Then he went to the little communications room and called for help.
And that concludes this week's installment of Anything You Can Do. Be sure to come back next week for Chapter 12.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
One of the good things about this podcast is I get to hear all kinds of stories. Here is one sent in for our military salute. Our storyteller asked that his real name not be used, so I will just call him Frank. It's called Recon Hell and is one heck of a ride. The desert is a flat, miserable, hot, and dry place. Yet we were duty-bound to protect it and ourselves. We were pushing through the area with a small company of men. Our job was to clean up stragglers that the main force had missed. It was dangerous work because those left behind were either very scared or seasoned military. Each nightfall we would stop and set up camp and start what we called Recon Hell. Basically, 3-man teams in jeeps would launch in 4 directions encircling the camp looking for hostiles. If found, we would mark their location and let the main encampment know. This was the most dangerous job it's been my displeasure to do. You're out there, in a lit-up vehicle, you might as well have a sign that read, "Target here." One night, James, Johnny, and I were on a north side run. We were the first out that night, so it was up to us to drop the markers. These would be used by the patrols that followed to be able to quickly set distance and location. We were on our 3rd marker when it happened. A blast shook our little jeep and the 3 of us were thrown from it. We had set off a landmine. None of us were injured, but the jeep was done and we were now on foot. The best plan would have been to radio for help and sit it out. However, seconds after the blast, we heard small arms fire and knew that we would be dead if we didn't get out of there. We grabbed what we could and headed for an outcropping of rock. We made the location and heard voices yelling in disgust at our escape. We took stock of what we had, and to our dismay, none of us had a working radio. What we had was 2 rifles, our side pistols, some meager rations. The jewel of the pile was a loaded flare gun with 2 extra rounds. I was the ranking non-com and made the decision to fire the first flare. That was followed by an all-out run to another set of rocks. Have you ever run in the desert? Between the shifting sands and uneven terrain, we all received more than a few cuts and bruises. We reached the second outcropping and set our defenses. Johnny was a sniper, so he set up shop atop the rocks. James was the navigator and radio man. He would protect Johnny's back. My job? Well, I was law enforcement, and I'll leave it at that. It took them a while to find us, but they did. Their first attempt to grab us was met with deadly fire from Johnny, and I laid out and subdued one of their lead trackers. He was yelling so loudly I had no choice but to knock him out. It was then that we heard the choppers approaching, so I fired a second flare. Not only did it alert the pilot to our location, but for a brief time it would light up the area right around us. Hopefully our pursuers would think twice about a second attempt. It was then that their sniper started his attack. I felt a bee sting my ear, which was followed by the crack of a rifle shot. This guy was good, and now I could wear earrings. I dove for better cover and tried to find his location. I need not have bothered because Johnny was already on him, returning the fire and asking if I was okay. James ran over and took a look and pronounced that I would live. This went on for several minutes, firing back and forth until the chopper arrived. Out of the bay of the big beast came machine gun fire, a few grenades, and the battle was over. We were picked up and taken back to camp. Frank went on to tell me that he was somewhat prepared for what happened, but has never really gotten over it. He said his left ear is still disfigured today, and even after 2 surgeries to repair it. He calls it his reminder of what was and was not just a terrifying dream. He actually survived it. My thanks to Frank, Johnny, and James, though that's not their real names, for their service that night. To Frank I say thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for your service. Our last listener story comes to us from Bob Larson, who was a private first class assigned to Company E, 7th Cavalry Regiment, U.S. Army during the Korean conflict. The story took place on May 6, 1951. Bob has called this one, The Attack in the Fog. The fog was so thick that day I couldn't see the man next to me. We were led down the road to a base of a hill. An officer, unknown to us, explained that the command wanted us to spread out on the road and fix bayonets. When the signal is given, we were to creep up the hill and catch the enemy by surprise with a bayonet attack. I have to say that I didn't think too much of this idea, and my buddies agreed to me, but we were outvoted. Some of the fellows didn't have bayonets and declared that the orders simply didn't apply to them, but they, too, were outvoted. So, up the hill we went, feeling our way along the ground with our feet. Step by step, we advanced. It seemed like an ugly dream, but I knew it was all too real. I looked to my right and then to my left to see any signs of my buddies. Much to my surprise, I could make out vague forms on each side of me. I could also hear whispers up and down the line and louder orders for them to shut up. While we were standing there arguing, the fog suddenly disappeared, just like somebody waved a magic wand or something. We were all caught out in the open with no cover in sight. The Chinese had also been caught by surprise. Both sides just stared at each other in complete bewilderment. A shot rang out, and somebody blew a whistle and shouted, "Retreat!" We bugged out at full speed back down the hill. Now, I don't speak or understand Chinese, but from behind us, I could understand the hilarious laughter coming from our enemies. No one was hurt that day, but from what I gather, a number of officers had some explaining to do. Bob Larson, Milton, Texas. That's a good one, Bob, and thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for your service. Well, that's the end of our special military edition of the show. I want to thank our contributors this week: Ray Payton, Anthony Carr, David Larson, Tom Williams, Mark Nelson, Frank, and finally, Bob Larson. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, it's easy to do. Just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There, you're going to find every possible link you could need. We're on Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many, many other services. Pick one and do leave some feedback about the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.